Okay.
Uh, yeah, please, maybe you can just sit. Correct.
Hello.
This is Professor Elise Rabur. He's the topmost mathematician in the
Very nice to meet you.
Professor Chellaney.
Hmm.
He was our head of mathematics.
Oh, wow.
I have watched you on TV, of course.
He was known in the world.
Sorry?
He's very well known in the world for mathematics. One of the star.
Hmm.
And then outside the market.
Hmm.
The Professor Aurora. We have Aurora. He's one of the conductors, all those CCBs and all those things.
I see.
He's also 80 plus.
Wow, yeah.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Amazing.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, here as well as on the internet or through YouTube. So, I welcome all of you for this really great JRD Tata lecture. And we have a very distinguished speaker today. So, without much ado, I request our director, Professor Jairam Chengalur, to say a few words and address you.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhu. So I don't really have much to say. I think that this is a very good and very nice initiative on behalf of the TIFR Alumni Association arranging the annual JRD Tata Lectures. It's a tradition that they've kept up for quite a long time now, 24 years, and next year, I guess, will be the Silver Jubilee. And I think each and every speaker that they have arranged for this session has been, distinguished, thought-provoking, and the lectures themselves, I think, form a really very interesting series of lectures. Today, of course, is no exception. We're very fortunate to have with us Professor Brahma Chellaney. I'd like to thank him for making the time to come here today and address us. And, I'm also very happy to see so many of our, distinguished alumni over here today. I think that's another nice purpose that this lecture series serves. It brings, the alumni once again back in contact with all of us on the campus. And so it's really nice to see so many familiar faces here again today. So with that, maybe I just welcome you again to the lecture and hand back to Prabhu.
Thank you, Professor Chengalur. Now, I request our president of TIFR Alumni Association, Professor Vaya, to address you all.
I don't have much to say. First of all, thank you, Prabhuji, and it's a pleasure to be here. A lot of my distinguished alumni could talk about each of them for their own distinguished work. There are a lot of juniors here, and I would like to request the juniors to consider becoming a member of the Alumni Association. First thing, because we organize lectures, we organize programs, and the younger the people, we are not getting any younger. So we need young people to come and actively participate in that. Having said that, it's a pleasure to organize a lecture like this because we need somebody of great distinction, and we have had great people of great distinction in science coming. But sometimes we need to look at the world beyond science, and especially in these days of Trump and whatnot, the world is becoming more confusing. You have to change, you have to sort of choose between sanity and understanding what is going on. And many of us choose sanity, as Professor Gurtu just said. Anyway, so with those reasons in mind, we requested Dr. Brahma Chellaney. I'm still very amused with his name, Brahma Chellaney. But anyway, those are stories for a different time. So that's why we requested Professor Chellaney, and we are very grateful to him that he has come today. He's come in the morning, he's leaving in the evening. That is a kind of schedule he lives by. But I'm very, very grateful to him for having spared the time. And I'm sure we will all learn a lot today from his lecture. Thank you very much, Dr. Chellaney, for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Vaya, for such a nice address. And now, before I introduce formally our today's speaker, I want to tell you that we have a very special discount today for this book that we published last time. And this is available for 1,200 rupees just outside. This is about the TIFR trees. So please do use this opportunity to buy this book there. So it is there till maybe evening, till 5 o'clock. So please hurry up, and after the lecture, please buy this as early as possible. Okay, with saying with all that, now let me start with my formal address. So Professor Chengalur, our director, Professor Vaya, our president, and our speaker for today, Professor Brahma Chellaney. A very warm welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to have you all here for the 24th JRD Tata Memorial Lecture organized by the TIFR Alumni Association. This annual lecture is our way of remembering and honoring JRD Tata, not just a pioneering industrialist, but as someone who deeply believed in the power of science, education, and institution building. His legacy continues to inspire all of us, and it is fitting that we come together each year to reflect on big ideas that shape our world. Now, the topic for today's talk, global geopolitical and geo-economic trends and their implications for India, is of topical interest. We are living in a time of a rapid global change. Power structures are shifting, economies are being realigned, and regional tensions are rising. So these developments have a direct bearing on India's position in the world. So understanding them is as important for diplomats and policymakers. It's also something that concerns all of us, and especially in academic and scientific communities. Now, and who better to help us make sense of all of this than Professor Brahma Chellaney? So all of you have already seen him in television also. So many of you may have already familiar with his work. He's a professor of strategic studies at the Center of Policy Research in New Delhi, one of the country's leading think tanks, and holds a PhD in international studies from JNU. But more than these titles, what really stands out is the way he brings together deep academic insights with the real world strategic thinking. And we already had some glimpse of that when we had some interaction with him before. So over the years, Professor Chellaney had played an important role in shaping discussions around the national security and foreign policy. He was among the experts who contributed to drafting India's proposed nuclear doctrine, a key part of our strategic framework. His writing appears regularly in both Indian and international media, and he is known for his clear, independent voice on complete and complex global issues. He has written several books, including two that focus on a topic we often overlook: water politics. His seminal book, Water, Asia's New Battleground, is a landmark achievement. In it, he masterfully illuminates how disputes over shared water resources are becoming a central driver for conflict and instability across the continent. So this work has become essential reading for policymakers, diplomats, and scholars, and fundamentally changing the way we think about resource security. Now, furthermore, his analysis on nuclear proliferation, the rise of asymmetric warfare, and the shifting power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific have been both prescient and influential. He's a prolific writer whose sharp, incisive commentary regularly appears in leading international publications, making complex strategic issues accessible to global audience. He does not shy away from uncomfortable truths, and his voice is one of clarity and conviction in a world often clouded by ambiguity. And of course, many of you will know that Professor Chellaney is one of who coined the phrase debt trap diplomacy. So all of you must have heard this much more in the newspapers. It is only widely used in global policy discussions to describe how some powerful nations use loans and infrastructure investments to gain leverage over others. So the fact that this term has entered everyday strategic vocabulary speaks volumes about the influence of his thinking. Now, there's a lot more that we could be said, but I think it is best if we hear directly from him. So without further delay, I invite Professor Chellaney to take the stage. So just before that, I would like to, I request our director, Professor Chengalur, to felicitate him with a moment.
Thank you very much. Very impressive. Thank you.
And also this book, which was produced by our head gardener.
Yeah.
It's on the books of
Wow.
TIFR.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's an amazing number of speakers. Enjoy it.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Professor Chellaney.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This is my first visit to TIFR. I'm very impressed with the campus, very impressed with the fact that this research institution blends art with research on very fundamental science issues. Also, I'm very impressed with the picturesque site on which this campus is located. So for me, this institution is really very special. It's unique in several ways. There's no other institution of this kind anyway in India. And it is a tribute to the people who set up this institution way back in the 1950s. It was conceived and brought into existence. And I wish there were more TFIRs in India, because this is the kind of institution that the country needs. So thank you for having me. My thanks to the director for hosting me, and my thanks to Professor Vaya, who worked so hard to organize all the logistics and bringing me here. My thanks to Dr. Prabhu for his kind introductory remarks. I've been asked to speak on a subject which is quite forbidding. I am supposed to make sense out of a confusing world, a world that is in complete turbulence and chaos. How do we actually make sense of this turbulent world? It's not easy. What I intend to do is to provide the broad contours of what's happening in the world. I'll leave the judgment to you as to what this means, not just for India, but for the broader world, because we are Indians, but we are also citizens of the world, and what happens in the world affects us, and of course, and what happens in India affects us directly. And therefore, whatever is happening in the world has a direct bearing on our welfare, on our future. Today, more than ever before, geopolitics holds the key to understanding even trade and investment patterns. Trade and investment patterns are shifting. Globalization is under siege. The international order is beginning to unravel. So this is a difficult time in human history. It's a difficult time principally because of one reason. The world order that came into being after World War II, that world order is giving way to a new world order, a new world order whose contours are still not visible. So one order is beginning to disappear very gradually toward a new world order, but whose contours are still not clearly visible on the horizon. So we are in transition times. And because we are in transition times, there is so much turbulence. It's like being on an aircraft when you hit bad weather, you know how it feels to be in a plane. So the turbulence that we are seeing now is largely because we are living in transition times. And geopolitics is clearly driving this turbulence. Way back when the Cold War ended, in the early 1990s, some of the younger people here may have not even been born, but when the Cold War ended, some Western analysts romantically visualized a new era, an era in which henceforth geoeconomics would dictate geopolitics. It was a very romantic vision of a future world. Today, economic power may be playing a greater role in shaping geopolitics, but geopolitics still drives geoeconomics, with political risk dominating financial markets. Major powers use geoeconomic initiatives to advance their geostrategic interests. A classic example of this is China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Outwardly, it looks like a geoeconomic initiative. In reality, it's a geopolitical initiative to advance China's foreign policy and strategic interests. And the flagship program under BRI is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Again, you know, the word economic is there, but its main driver is geopolitical. It is to deepen China's penetration of Pakistan and to use Pakistan as a strategic lever against India. So the romantic's future world that some Western analysts had visualized in the early 1990s still remains a world of our dreams. The fact is that today's geopolitics has become increasingly murky, increasingly toxic, and that clearly is triggering major developments in the world. To put it mildly, the world today is at a crossroads. It's at a crossroads where the future direction remains uncertain. The crises, conflicts, and wars that we are seeing in the world underline the fact that we live in fraught times. Whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's aggressive expansionism, America's extraterritorial assassinations, or Israel's devastating war in Gaza, all point to one direction, that the post-World War II order that emerged under American leadership is giving way to a new order. What we are seeing is the return of might makes right. There was all this talk for such a long time that we are living in a rules-based order. We knew that a rules-based order was a myth. But now even the pretense of a rules-based order is being demolished. So nobody now even tries to pretend, especially in a Trumpian age, that this is a rules-based order. The US president openly displays his disdain for international norms and rules, and he's not an exception. Xi Jinping of China is not an exception. He doesn't talk every day, he doesn't post on social media, but that doesn't make him any different than Donald Trump. And what is happening in Gaza or what's happening in Ukraine all tell us the same story. Might makes right. I mean, this is such a different world from the world some Western analysts were projecting when the Cold War ended. It goes to show that in geopolitics, you cannot make linear projections. This is not the kind of research that you do here in fundamental science, because geopolitics doesn't work in this fashion. You cannot make linear projections about the direction of the world, because geopolitics by its very nature is uncertain. And because we live in transition times, we are seeing profound developments. These profound developments range from potentially groundbreaking advances in critical and emerging technologies, including biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, to significant shifts in trade and investment patterns. To give you just one example, China, whose economic success was driven largely by the West. Under the US leadership, the West helped in the rise of China. Today, China trades more with the global South than with the West. This is one of the many profound developments that we are seeing. Now, in this wider picture, there are some important geopolitical and geo-economic trends that are worth noting. One is rising protectionism in the world. As geopolitical tensions rise, countries are increasingly embracing nationalistic and protectionist policies, leading to greater tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and less open trade policies. in the 10-year period before Trump returned to the White House, between 2015 and 2024, in that period, the average global tariffs doubled from 2.5% to 4.5%. And of course, now Trump is pursuing a tariff-centric approach. He has weaponized tariffs as a new tool. He has turned tariffs into a new sanctions instrument to achieve his geopolitical objectives. And we're going to see the average global tariffs rise significantly from this year onwards, because what he is doing will create a response from other countries. Most countries may not have immediately retaliated, but in the coming months and coming years, you will see how this in turn, what Trump is doing, will create a backlash and will create a significant rise in average global tariffs. So populism is clearly on the rise, including in Europe, for example. And as a result, we are seeing globalization not only in retreat, we are seeing the danger of globalization in reverse. Globalization in reverse, that is rolling back some aspects of globalization. The second major trend is that rivalries between the major powers have become central to international relations. This is sharpening competition across political, technological, military, and ideological domains. This in turn is having adverse impacts on international institutions. The most international of all international institutions, as you know, is the United Nations. United Nations is the most international of the international institutions because every country in the world is a member of the UN. There are 193, maybe now 194 countries in the world. They are all member states of the UN. But when you look at the UN, what role has the UN played in all these conflicts, crises, and wars? Did it play a role, or has it played a role in the Ukraine war? Has it played a role in the recent Middle East wars and crises? No. The UN has become a bystander. It's been watching developments. The UN Security Council is tasked under the UN Charter with maintaining international peace and security. And yet, the UN has become increasingly marginalized in global affairs. And this is largely because of two reasons. One reason being that there have been no structural reforms in the UN to make the UN more relevant to today's geopolitical realities. And the second is the gridlock in the Security Council. Because of the sharpening rivalries between the major powers, getting a consensus among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council on any significant issue has become very difficult. So there's a gridlock in the Security Council. Or take the example of the World Trade Organization, WTO. Today it's unable to play effectively its role in the core areas of monitoring, negotiation, and dispute settlement. Why? Because the major powers have contributed to undermining the WTO. Did Trump notify the WTO of his tariffs against any nation? No. He just ignored it as if it doesn't exist. But under the WTO rules, you're supposed to provide prior notification to the WTO. But who cares now? The only country that notifies the WTO of anything is India, probably. because we are always the last adherents to international law. Well, China did it more rhetorically, in the sense that it said it's going to the WTO, but then imposed its own retaliatory tariffs on the US. So it didn't really bother about the WTO either. It pretended it will seek the WTO's intercession, but then it slapped its own counter tariffs on the US, which brought the US to the negotiating table. The reason why the WTO is not able to play its mandated role is that the very key powers that wield geopolitical and economic power in the world are not interested in keeping the WTO functional. For example, if you look at the WTO's dispute settlement system, of which the appellate body is the key, that dispute settlement system has become dysfunctional because of the US blockage on new appointments. Take the appellate body of the WTO. It's the highest court for dispute settlement in the WTO. It requires 3 members to hear any appeal from a nation state. But the US has repeatedly blocked the appointment of new members. So there aren't sufficient number of members to hold appellate body hearings. So in effect, the appellate body has become dysfunctional. So without dismantling the WTO's dispute settlement system, the key powers have made the WTO irrelevant in today's global trading regime. Another trend, which is quite obvious to all of you, is that the world is becoming more multipolar. Instead of one power dominating, we have seen the rise of several powers. To some extent, this was inevitable because if you look at the West, it makes up only 12% of the global population. But since the 19th century, or at least the second half of the 19th century, it has dominated the world, first because of colonization, then by its dominance of international institutions, especially after World War II. But now, the West's contribution to global GDP is in sharp decline. So this configuration of the global geopolitical landscape was inevitable. It had to happen sooner or later. And finally, it's becoming clearer that what is emerging is a much more multipolar world. In this multipolar emerging world, the US-China emerging Cold War, I say emerging Cold War, is a key defining element. And this emerging Cold War between the US and China is happening in parallel to America's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. As a result, Russia and China are coming closer together. Russia and China are not natural allies, they're natural competitors historically. It's US policy that is bringing them closer together. And this is, in fact, antithetical to American interests. The US won the Cold War, not militarily. It won the Cold War by co-opting China onto its side. In the second half of the Cold War, the Nixon-Kissinger opening brought China de facto into the US side to help contain Soviet power and influence, which eventually contributed to Soviet imperial overreach and ultimately to Soviet Union's disintegration. Now a 2-against-1 competition is re-emerging, but with America as the target. So this is certainly not in America's own interest, which is one reason why Donald Trump is seeking to prevent a cementing of the Sino-Russian alliance. And I think he's wise, at least in that aspect, to try and wean Russia away to the extent that he can, if he can, away from the embrace of China, because that is essential for America's own continued global preeminence. A fourth trend is that given these rising tensions and rivalries in the world, the specter of the global economy fragmenting into rival geopolitical blocs, that specter has emerged. If the global economy does fragment into rival geopolitical blocs, it will not only affect global economic growth, but also imperil global peace. A similar trend happened in the 1930s when there was a shift from multilateral trade to trade within geopolitical blocs that contributed to growing geopolitical tensions, which in turn led to World War II. So this danger of economic fragmentation is a cause for worry. And we're seeing some other developments in this context that suggest that this economic fragmentation is possible. For example, we're seeing the emphasis on supply side reshoring in the name of supply side diversification. Bring manufacturing back to your country from overseas. Of course, this is part of the nationalist, protectionist economic policies that are rearing their head. We're also seeing efforts towards tech decoupling, which is creating parallel tech ecosystems and driving up R&D costs. We're also seeing rising geopolitical risk premium in the financial markets because of uncertainty and conflicts, including in the Middle East, Ukraine war, or the Taiwan Strait. Then another trend is the global push towards decarbonization and renewable energy sources. Now, the market implications for this are apparent from the investment shifts. Now, massive investments are going into renewables, electric vehicles, battery storage, and green technologies. And there is a sharp decline in traditional fossil fuel investments. India is a key player in this energy transition. India, as you know, has its own ambitious renewable energy targets. The key challenge for India in this area is to meet its growing energy demand while decarbonizing. This is no easy challenge. According to the Paris-based International Energy Institute, or the International Energy Agency rather, India will remain the world's largest driver of oil demand at least until 2030. And India, as you know, imports nearly 90% of its oil needs. So India is becoming a dominant force in the oil markets because it's not only the world's third largest energy consumer, but such a huge importer of oil. And it has to meet these renewable energy targets while meeting its energy demands and while also seeking to decarbonize. There's some other trends, and I'll be very brief because I want to then focus a little bit on India's strategic options and the challenges that India faces. One other global trend is the global debt and fiscal pressures. A growing number of countries are grappling with high levels of public and private debt. In terms of the markets, this has meant higher interest rates, which in turn means higher borrowing costs. This is making foreign capital dearer, costlier, including for India. And then there is one other trend which I wish to flag, which is an emerging trend. It's a trend that is not concrete at the moment, but it's emerging. And this is the movement toward a more multipolar currency landscape. A more multipolar currency landscape in which the US dollar remains dominant, but faces increasing competition from other major currencies. The US dollar today reigns supreme. It's the world's primary reserve currency. 2 years ago, Donald Trump said publicly that the US dollar's status as the world's premier or primary reserve currency is what makes America, quote unquote, strong and powerful. If de-dollarization gains momentum, he warned, it will be the equivalent of America losing a world war. We will become a second-tier country, he said, a second-tier country. It's because of the US dollar's dominance that the US can actually employ financial sanctions against other countries. If the dollar loses its preeminence, US sanctions would become a blunt instrument. Countries wouldn't bother about the US sanctions. So not only does the dollar's preeminence give America power and strength, but also allows the US to weaponize finance. And we have seen how in recent years, the US and its allies in Europe have weaponized finance, principally against Russia, but also sending a signal to the rest of the world. Now, the de-dollarization trend may not be concrete, but it's real in one sense. It is that countries are now seeking to diversify to the extent that they can, diversify away from the US dollar into other major currencies. Why is this emerging trend happening? What are the geopolitical motivations? The first is the sanctions risk. I just described that the US has weaponized the dollar to to impose sanctions on countries. The second reason is that America's own debt and fiscal policy is raising concern in a number of countries about the long-term value of dollar-denominated assets. A US debt and fiscal crisis at home can actually create havoc for those who are putting their money largely in dollar-denominated assets. So it makes sense to diversify. So what we're seeing is a movement toward diversification, increased use of alternative currencies in bilateral trade is happening. This is happening through two mechanisms in particular. One is bilateral currency swaps, and secondly, by settling commodity transactions. Commodity transactions, especially in oil and gas, in non-dollar currencies. At the beginning of 2022, that is just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in January 2022, almost 100% of the world's oil trade was denominated in US dollars. Now, more than 1/3 of the global oil trade is happening in currencies other than the dollar. This has happened in 3.5 years. For example, if you look at Russian oil purchases by India, a lot of this Russian oil is being purchased by Indian refineries through Abu Dhabi oil merchants, with payments being in Emirati dirham, not in US dollars. So we are seeing a shifting pattern now in commodity transactions. And also we are seeing central banks in some key countries, China, India, Turkey, Brazil, especially in the global south, also in Eastern Europe, central banks are diversifying into non-dollar currencies and into gold. Central banks are holding gold. They're buying gold in such quantities in the last 3-4 years that the gold continues to reach new record highs. Look at the international price of gold, how it has really shot up in the last 2-3 years in particular. And one of the principal drivers of this soaring price of gold is central banks holding gold. Why? They're hedging. They're hedging. They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. They're trying to diversify away from the US dollar. So as I said, this is not a concrete trend. The de-dollarization is not a concrete trend. It's an emerging trend, a very significant one. In fact, I should point out that any geo-economic trend takes a number of years before it becomes concrete, before it gains concrete shape. So it will be several years before de-dollarization gains momentum. What is important is that such a trend has begun. Of course, in the short term, rapid abandonment of the dollar is not possible. But if you are a US policymaker, you would be definitely worried about this ominous new trend, which holds important implications for the future status of the US dollar. Now, let me turn now to India. As you all know, that India's international profile and geopolitical weight are rising. Nobody doubts that. And India has been fortunate in this century at least to have had two things which are very important for any country that is rising: political stability and relatively strong economic growth. We had, 6 years of Vajpayee, 10 years of Manmohan Singh leadership, now 11 years under Modi. This period of at least what's been 27 years now of political stability, rapid economic growth, this has clearly added momentum to India's rise, because without political stability, you cannot even have rapid economic growth. So, and without rapid economic growth, you cannot actually add real muscle to a national path. So the two are linked. So we are fortunate in that sense to have had both strong economic growth and political stability. And then in more recent years, we're also having accelerated military modernization. India is now the world's third largest defense spender. We are the world's third largest defense spender after the US and China. We remain the world's largest arms importer, despite the Modi government's effort to increase domestic manufacturing of defense equipment. Being the world's largest defense importer does not redound to India's credit. It's a black mark on India, So it's not something that you would like to boast about, that you are the world's largest arms importer, but that doesn't show you in good light, in fact. And we have been the largest arms importer for a number of years now. So that actually is a sad part about our overall strength, that we remain the world's largest arms importer, which means that we are making our country poorer and making the military industrial complexes of other countries stronger by remaining the world's largest arms importer. But this combination of being the world's fastest growing major economy, which is what India is today, and accelerated military modernization, this combination makes India a rising global player. So that is the good news. And in fact, India has been rising, as I pointed out, under 3 successive prime ministers. But the watershed moment for India's rise has largely been forgotten. Do you know what the watershed moment was? And it's connected to your institute and to Mumbai. The 1998 nuclear weapon tests. They were the watershed moment for India's rise, in which Mumbai played a central role. Bhabha Atomic Research Center was pivotal. Your own institution is under the Department of Atomic Energy, which is headquartered. DAE is headquartered in Mumbai. So that was Mumbai's contribution, which the country has forgotten. I'm not talking about country forgetting Mumbai's contribution. We have forgotten even about the watershed moment. I remember that when 2 successive governments were thinking of conducting these nuclear weapon tests, and I was involved in some of the discussions, and there was so much concern in the government at that time at the highest level that if we do this, the Americans will come down on us with a ton of bricks. Actually, they did impose sanctions on us. But this became the development that freed us from US sanctions. For 3 decades, from the 1971 Bangladesh War of Liberation, when the Americans sent the USS Enterprise to the southern tip of India to threaten India, to prevent the birth of Bangladesh. From then, for 3 decades, the Americans imposed harsh sanctions on India. And in the same period, the US aided the rise of China, the economic rise of China, creating an expansionist monster on India's northern borders. And in the same period, the US armed Pakistan to make it a military counterweight to India, while keeping India under sanctions. But once we conducted the nuclear weapon tests, initially, the Americans imposed even more sanctions. But within a few months, the Americans were making overtures to New Delhi. They began sending Strobe Talbot for talks with India. Then came President Bill Clinton to New Delhi, and then completely changed the trajectory of US-India relations. The sanctions began gradually being lifted by the US. So for 24 years, after the first Pokhran test of 1974, out of fear, we didn't conduct a real nuclear weapon test. We said the 1974 test was a technology demonstrator, a peaceful nuclear explosion, PNE. BARC was not, BARC, Bhabha Atomic Research Center was not allowed to test its weapon designs, nuclear warhead designs. But when we finally did it, the sanctions against us began lifting. And that, the nuclear deterrent that we developed gave us confidence. The confidence to rise, the confidence to do things. Before that, before 1998 and post 1998, our national psyche underwent a profound change. And today, most people don't even remember how 1998 was a watershed moment. In the coming years, India will likely play a bigger role on the global stage. And mind you, the new global order will be shaped not in Europe, where the Ukraine war is being fought. It will not be shaped in the Middle East, where the US is still embroiled. It will be shaped in the Indo-Pacific, where India's role is going to be increasingly critical. The Indo-Pacific is the emerging economic and geopolitical hub of the world. But India has one major handicap. One major handicap that India has is that India is located in a very combustible neighborhood. India's troubled neighborhood is apparent. In whichever direction India looks, India only sees threats. North, west, east, anyway, it's threats. And this is the irony of it. If you look at India's strategic and economic partnerships, they're all with countries located far away from India. All, like Japan, South Korea, Europe, United States, Australia. But in its own neighborhood, around India, only threats, only problems, only spillover effects that India has to manage. Whenever I go to Israel, and I've been to Israel a few times, not since Israel began this devastating war in Gaza, but over the last 20 years, I've been to Israel a few times. But one question that all Israelis, especially Israeli analysts and officials, ask me, when you come down to a discussion, is that which country's neighborhood is worse? Is India's neighborhood worse than Israel's, or Israel's neighborhood worse than India? Once they ask that question, I know the discussion will go off the tangent, because then they're no longer interested in my presentation. And it happened in one think tank. The chair asked me, before you begin, can I ask you one simple question? I said, sure. He asked me, whose neighborhood is worse, India's or Israel's? Then for the next 1 hour, they forgot about my presentation, and they all discussed whose neighborhood is worse. So the thing is that we are worse than, our neighborhood is worse than Israel's, I tell them, because on one side they have the Mediterranean Sea. But in India's case, we are surrounded. We are the geographic hub of South Asia. We share borders, land borders or sea frontiers with every other South Asian country. Other South Asian countries don't share borders, but we share borders with each of them. Myanmar to Pakistan, Nepal to Sri Lanka, to the Maldives. We share land and sea borders with all these countries, right? So political and economic instability in India's immediate neighborhood has spillover effects. Now look at what's happening in Bangladesh. After Hasina's overthrow, this country is becoming an Islamist citadel with spillover implications for India. So India's task continues to be to minimize the spillover effects from its immediate neighborhood, while continuing to build strategic and economic partnerships with countries located far beyond its region. So I think in this larger picture, one should not forget this major handicap that India faces. Now, coming to India's foreign policy very briefly, there are three key elements of India's foreign policy. One, it's shorn of ideology. There's no ideology in India's foreign policy. Because it's non-ideological, it's pragmatic. It's geared toward revitalizing India's economic and military security without having to choose one major power over another as the country's dominant partner. In practice, though, under Prime Minister Modi, building stronger ties with the United States, building stronger ties with the US has been the signature foreign policy initiative. So it's somewhat ironic that today US-India relations have plunged to their lowest level in this century. This is when the Prime Minister of India has invested so much political capital in building stronger ties with the US, and under his leadership, ties have sunk. And of course, they began to fray even when Joe Biden was in office. In fact, it began under Joe Biden, the fraying of the US-India relationship. It was he who began playing the Khalistan and human rights cards against India. It was he who modernized and upgraded Pakistan's F-16 fleet, made it more lethal against India. It was the Biden administration that initiated the IMF bailout packages for Pakistan. So the fraying, and there were two major indictments that were designed to target the Modi government by the Biden administration. So the fraying of the US-India relationship began under Biden, and Donald Trump seems to have taken off from where Biden left. But so it's somewhat ironical that when India under Modi had been investing so much political capital in building stronger ties with the US, that the US has done things that actually fracture or at least undermine and undercut this once blossoming relationship. A third key element of India's foreign policy is balance. And this is apparent from India's membership of rival multilateral groupings. India is a member of the Quad, which is led by the US effectively. And there's no leader of the Quad, but the US is in the driver's seat in the Quad. But India is also a member of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. BRICS and the SCO are both coming under China's shadow, which is not India's friend, but India's adversary. So you can see India is a member of rival multilateral groupings. India is one of the very few countries in the world that can reach out to rival countries and serve as go-between. It has built strong relationships with rival powers. In East Asia, India has strong strategic and economic relations with South Korea and Japan, historical rivals. In the Middle East, India has strong strategic and economic ties with both Israel and key Arab states. In fact, I think one of Modi's prominent legacies would be the strong relationships he has built with the rulers of the key oil sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf region. This didn't happen under Manmohan Singh or under Vajpayee. This happened, under Modi, which is ironical because he is portrayed in the Western media as a Hindu nationalist, and yet with the rulers of the Gulf oil sheikdoms, he has built personal rapport with them. For example, with the Emirati ruler Sheikh Zayed, he calls him brother. Number of times that Modi has been to the UAE, or the number of times the UAE ruler has been to India, or the kind of partnerships or the personal rapport Modi has built with Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, with the rulers of Oman, or even with the rulers of Oman, Kuwait, and some of the other Arab states. That's I think to me that comes as a surprise that he's been that successful, because we didn't invest political capital in building close relations with these countries. They were at one time very pro-Pakistan. Today, for example, they play a neutral role. When Operation Sindoor happened, these very various oil sheikdoms, these key Arab countries, did not take sides of Pakistan. They stayed neutral. This was a big change from, let's say, what happened in the Kargil War, what happened, when the Mumbai terrorist killings happened, the massacres, in Mumbai. Then, they didn't come out so openly on India's side. This time they publicly all of them condemned the Pelgam massacre. This has been a very positive development for India. But India also faces foreign policy challenges. And one key challenge, the most prominent one, is the strengthening axis between China and Pakistan. This strategic axis between China and Pakistan is growing stronger. It is creating the specter of a two-front war for India. And during the Operation Sindoor, as you all know, you must have read from newspapers that according to India's own deputy chief of army, the deputy army chief, during Operation Sindoor, during the military operation, China provided real assistance to Pakistan in terms of providing real-time satellite reconnaissance data and other intelligence inputs, including radar inputs. It repositioned satellites so that Pakistan could target Indian military sites. All this happened during that operation of a 3-day nature. So it really shows how the strategic axis is strong and growing. In fact, India is the only country in the world that is wedged between two nuclear-armed countries that are allies, close allies. No other country is wedged between two nuclear-armed countries. In India's case, these two are close allies. They are both revisionist states. They both lay claims to large territories of India, but different parts of India. In the sense that the territories that Pakistan covets in India are not the same territories that China wants to grab from India, but they're both territorially and geopolitically revisionist states, not satisfied with the status quo. They want to revise the territorial borders. So this is a growing challenge, and how India addresses it is something that continues to challenge our policymakers, to say the least. So to conclude, the global geopolitical and geo-economic trends that are outlined provide India both opportunities and risks. The risks largely come from the threat of the global economy fragmenting, because India wants to stay neutral. It has always been an independent power. It has always pursued an independent approach to international affairs. That won't change. Successive governments in India have adhered to an independent approach to international relations. So when the world gets divided, or the world economy gets fragmented, it'll be difficult for independent powers to choose sides, because independent powers by nature don't want to take sides. And therefore, economic fragmentation will challenge India considerably. But overall, I would say that the opportunities for India are certainly greater than the risks, even in today's very uncertain and volatile world. In fact, if India plays its card wisely, India could emerge as the bridge builder, as at least one of the bridge builders in an increasingly divided world. India's size underscores both its opportunities and challenges. India has 600 million more people than all the 44 countries of Europe put together. Just think of it. There are 600 million more Indians than all the 44 countries of Europe put together. The fact that India is a subcontinent-sized country gives India geopolitical and geo-economic heft. It gives India that kind of muscle. But it also underscores the scale of India's challenges. So size is both an opportunity and a challenge. This means that any leadership in New Delhi will have to always act very wisely, think in a forward-looking manner, because how we shape our future is very much in our own hands, and we have to act wisely so that we emerge as a global power. India is 1/6 of humanity. There's no reason why we shouldn't be a global power. In fact, we are entitled to be a global power. The only amazing thing is that we are still not a global power. We should be a global power. And we should all think and aspire, and in fact, work towards being a global power. We are a global player, but not a global power. There's a difference between the two. And we have to aspire to be a global power. We have to be the world's next big global manufacturing hub. We have to be the world's next big global manufacturing hub. Only by becoming a global manufacturing hub can we address our unemployment crisis. There's no other way to address the fact that many of our young don't have proper employment. Given our demographic dividend, given our large youthful workforce, the combination of the two can drive consumption and innovation. But we need to have skilled manpower. It means that we need to invest not just in infrastructure and manufacturing, we need to invest on human capital. The TFIR is one example of how investment in human capital is critical. So we have to spend a lot more on education and training, and we're not doing that. That is critical to our future. But now the last sentence, India is uniquely placed at the convergence of the geo-economic and geopolitical trends that are described. India's rising profile, its huge domestic market, its political stability, its reform momentum, and diplomatic agility make India a standout emerging economy. Now we have to translate that into becoming a real global power. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for such a great talk. The talk is now open for your questions and comments. I know a lot of comments and questions will be there. So I'll just come one by one.
Okay, I have, well, this was a very interesting, eye-opening talk. I have two questions basically. One is about India. I mean, could India have done something differently? As you said, we seem to be surrounded by all not very friendly neighbors. I mean, Pakistan is an exceptional case, dating from the time of partition. Okay, so I think let's leave that. But with the others, could one have followed more magnanimous policies? I mean, smaller countries, Nepal, and Bangladesh, in which India actually helped in its formation, and even that has completely turned. I mean, is there something wrong we did, or we should have done something differently? And secondly, as you said, that in these last 10, 11 years, one has pivoted more towards the US, including getting more forcefully into Quad and all that. Could that be the reason for China getting more riled with us and doing all this Galvan and this and that? Okay, these two things.
I think your second question is easier than the first one. I don't think China would have behaved otherwise, even if India had not joined the Quad, because China's enmity towards India goes back many, many years. The Chinese saying there cannot be two suns. There's only one sun, and in Asia, China wants to be the preeminent power. And the only potential peer rival in terms of size is India. So it has pursued a policy for a long time, since Mao's time, to contain India. And it was because of that that it formed this de facto alliance with Pakistan. The primary reason was to keep India boxed in on the subcontinent. That was the prime reason why the Sino-Pakistan axis emerged. I hope you can hear me from here. I don't have to use this mic. Okay, good. So to answer your question telegraphically, I don't think India's non-membership in Quad would have made a difference. We would have still experienced Chinese hostility, maybe not to the same extent, but in terms of the Chinese rhetoric, but in terms of Chinese containment of India, I don't think there would have been a material difference. Now, to your first question, which is a very fundamental question, which will require actually to answer it, we will need to have a more open and frank discussion because there are many elements to it. One is India's own role. India, being a democracy and very inward-looking democracy, a country that often doesn't think of putting itself in the other's shoes and looking from outside inside as to how it should behave. For example, we did things that were outwardly and in fact, unquestionably stupid. For example, imposing a blockade on Nepal under the present government. We did that, and that changed the national psyche among the Nepalese people. That brother India did that to us. I think for a generation, we spoiled our relations with Nepal because of one stupid act. Then, again, sticking to Nepal under Manmohan Singh's time, because successive governments can be equally stupid. So stupidity is not the prerogative of one government in India. In my experience, successive governments have behaved in an immature manner on critical issues. The Manmohan Singh government aided the overthrow of the king of Nepal. It hosted the Maoists in India. It helped engineer the coup, against the king, creating a needless headache for India. So the original sin goes back to that period, compounded by the Modi government's blockade of Nepal. Nepal is tied to India symbiotically. This is a country that has such strong cultural, historical links with India. Yet, if today India is competing with China in Nepal, it's partly because of our own faults, our own sins. There should be no mistake about it. That we are also responsible for, and in fact, the reason why successive communist governments have been in power in Nepal for a number of years now, largely because of India. Because we don't think long term, we don't think strategically, and therefore, we often think in terms of near-term objectives. If we do even think of near-term objectives, often we're driven by domestic politics. In the case of Manmohan Singh, it was driven by the fact that the communists in India were part of the coalition. They had links with the Maoists of Nepal, and all these other dubious elements came into the picture, affecting a foreign policy, a policy towards a very critical neighbor, Nepal. But then there are other stories, for example, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, and all. Because the other factor is the role of external players in creating this regional mayhem, regional chaos. The US policy over the years has contributed to making South Asia a region that is, by and large, dysfunctional. In Pakistan, American policy has promoted the military at the expense of civilian authority since the 1950s, right? They've supported repeatedly military coups, military generals, even now, even though there's only a civilian government in name in Pakistan. The real power is with the army, and the US is very happy, right? The way Trump hosted Asim Munir and hosted him for lunch. First time an American president ever hosted a foreign army chief, a foreign army chief who did not have the title of president or prime minister at the White House. Never before has the American president hosted a foreign army chief for a private luncheon. Never before. It goes to show how, in fact, by doing that, he undermined the civil authority. Whatever, as it is, Prime Minister Sharif doesn't have much authority, but by hosting Asim Munir and saying he's the most powerful man in Pakistan, the Trump administration clearly, pulled the rug from under Prime Minister Sharif's feet. Take Bangladesh. Who was after Hasina? The Americans, right? They outplayed India. India was caught napping. Should India have been caught napping by the developments? No. But it was the role of the US can't be ignored. Myanmar, look at the irony of it. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, the US is supporting military-backed governments today. And in Myanmar, another important neighbor of India, the US is seeking to overthrow a military government by arming rebels. Rebels who are creating instability and lawlessness even in Manipur, India. So by pursuing the Myanmar strategy, the US is even destabilizing India's northeast. So yes, India's role has to be looked at in terms of why the region is so troubled. But the role of foreign powers, or the role of China today, the biggest arms clients of China, who are they? Number one, Pakistan. Number two, Bangladesh. Number three, Myanmar. All immediate neighbors of India. So external powers continue to play mischief, and Indian policymakers are not thinking in a manner, strategically, in a manner that would seek to minimize the regional chaos. So that, sorry, is the short answer to a very complex question that you asked.
Excellent talk. I loved it. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on one more global trend, which is a global fall in fertility rate. The entire world is, apart from a few countries, is aging. And that is leading to a lot of, in and out migration across countries. So what is your thoughts on how this fits into all the other global trends and how India, in India as well, the fertility rate is actually going down by 2040 or 2050, something, we are supposed to reach, equal, whatever the term is, where birth and death sort of becomes equal, right? So what are your thoughts?
It's a good question because two things are very important in power, global power. One is population, other is economic growth. And the two are linked. If the population is in decline, if there's a demographic crisis, will have an impact on economic growth. So what we are seeing is that a number of economies today that were booming earlier, these economies are stalling because their populations are in decline. China itself is facing a shrinking and aging population, China, which is the reason why Xi Jinping is in a hurry. He's in a hurry to achieve China's strategic objectives because he knows he doesn't have too many years. 10 years from now, China would have run fully into structural constraints on its growth, economic growth, constraints on its greater accumulation of greater economic and military power. So he's in a man-tearing hurry. That's the reason why this is India's moment now. And as you rightly point out, that India's own fertility rate, not because of state coercion, not because of imposition of one-child norm, nothing. On its own, India's overall fertility rate is going down. It's going down regionally in parts of India. It'll also happen in the other parts of India gradually. So we have, again, a limited window to reap the demographic dividend. We can't wait 20 years from now to become a great power, right? This is our time. And that's the reason why we should be in a bigger hurry than even Xi Jinping, because if we don't aspire to be a great power, that moment, the moment of today, would have passed.
You mentioned sometime during the talk that we import a very large percentage of our energy needs, petrochemical needs. And it's something like 90% or so.
Oil.
Now, isn't this a great deal of strategic infirmity or challenge at least? Because if you look at 1930s Japan, it was playing mischief in China, but nevertheless, because of the blockades that was created by United States, it was really soon in a great deal of trouble. And ultimately it lost its preeminence in the East Asian region. So that's number one. That's one of the questions. And maybe another question, which is maybe related to in some way or other, is that you have emphasized the growth of India, the economic growth. But economic growth in India has also come at the cost of a great deal of economic inequalities among the population. So isn't that another challenge? And how do we address that challenge with something that you have referred to by addressing educational opportunities or skills opportunities? But are we getting there, or are we very far away from there?
Well, to answer your second question first, inequalities are growing in India, but they're also growing in China, for example. In India, the inequalities are very sharp and quite wide, which makes it very important for us to do what I said in my presentation, which is to become the world's next big global manufacturing hub, which means you have to invest more in education. We're not investing in education sufficiently. We're not investing sufficiently in skilled manpower development. These are two critical areas where if you invest in these two areas, the inequalities are going to decline. When you have people who are more educated, people who are more skilled, people who are more employable, that also creates a better base for higher value chain manufacturing.
That also takes time.
It takes time because there are no quick solutions to anything. Especially in a country the size of India, you have to start doing things in a systematic way, knowing that it will take time. But to your first question, you're right, absolutely. It was America's energy blockade of Japan that effectively triggered World War II. That led to the Pacific War, at least, not to the greater World War II, but to the Pacific War that brought Japan into World War II, into the alliance with Germany. It was the blockade, the energy blockade of Japan by the US that triggered the Pearl Harbor attack and led to the US-Japan war. Everybody now knows that energy security lies in diversification, which is the reason why China, knowing that example from the 1940s of how the US blockaded Japan, has increasingly been buying Russian oil and gas through the land route, through pipeline, because that cannot be interdicted by hostile forces. India, unfortunately, doesn't have any neighboring country or countries from which it can buy oil and gas through the land route. And therefore, what India is seeking to do is to also diversify. That is, diversify by buying from multiple sources. Russian oil was became available at a discount only after the Europeans turned their back on cheap Russian energy. So it's only in the last 3 years or so that Russian oil became attractive to India. But the Indian diversification energy, especially in oil and gas supplies, began much earlier. But unfortunately, again, the role of a third party, the US, has compounded India's energy challenges because India's nearest oil and gas supplier is a neighbor, Iran. It's next door. And historically, that is traditionally, not historically, but traditionally, over the last many decades, Iran provided India discounts on oil purchases. But the Americans under Donald Trump in 2019 imposed sanctions on Iran. China refused to comply, but we complied fully with the US sanctions and cut off all our energy links with Iran. That was at the cost, at great cost to our economy. So we had to buy more expensive oil from elsewhere. Then the Americans under Trump in this first term also imposed sanctions on Venezuela. We had made major investments there also, major investments in oil there. Again, we lost out from the US sanctions. Unfortunately, wherever the US has imposed, wherever against whichever country the US has imposed sanctions in this century, the sole beneficiary, the main beneficiary has been China. The Americans have ended up aiding China's further accumulation of economic and military power by sanctioning countries. Iran, now the biggest investor and trading partner of Iran is China.
Why don't back to Iran?
Because we are a meek country, we're a soft state. You know, we don't want to face US sanctions, right? The Chinese, but we now see.
We're scared.
China doesn't care a damn, right? So they said, okay, you want to impose sanctions on us, impose them. The Americans have threatened, but for now, the Iran sanctions by the US were applied in 2019. More than 6 years have gone by. The Americans have only threatened China, not applied any Iran-related sanctions against China. But India meekly capitulated immediately. It's in our nature, by the way. It's nothing to do with any government in office. Any other government had been in office, we would have done the same thing. That's the reason why for 24 years, after Pokhran 1, after 1974, successive governments in India refused to do a second nuclear weapons test. In fact, after that PNE, we never dared to do a nuclear weapon test. In fact, it happened because Vajpayee had been in office only for 6 weeks. Had he been in office for 6 months, the 1998 test wouldn't have happened. Wouldn't have happened because our system is very corrupting. Our bureaucrats, others would have all piled on the Prime Minister. Heavens will fall if you go ahead, right? Because he was fresh in office. He had already made up his mind before he took office that he will go nuclear. It happened in 6 weeks. In fact, he gave the go-ahead soon after coming to office. And I told people in his cabinet that if he had waited 6 months, and it was true, and they all agreed with me, that these tests wouldn't have happened. So what I'm saying is not based on some unrealistic assessment. As I said, assessment, excuse me, his own colleagues shared. So, our system is overcautious, erring on the side of caution. Sorry?
Said 6 weeks versus 6 months. So it's been 11 years. So I would like to do anything more.
The longer you stay in power, the softer you become in India. In my honest view, I may be mistaken, but the longer you stay in power, the less willing you are to think originally, act assertively. You become more obsessed with staying in power. The longer you are in power, the more in love you are with power for power's sake, you don't want to leave office, so you become a prisoner of your own thinking, and this has been under successive governments, by the way. Nothing to do with this present government. I've seen that under successive governments, because living in Delhi, I've had the good fortune, or the bad fortune of interacting with people in the government over the years, and I can say that that's the reason why the coalition governments under Devi Gowda and I.K. Gujral, in my view, were very good, because the two prime ministers then were full of energy. They knew that their days in office were numbered. They were full of ideas, full of energy. I have never seen two governments in my career, and I'm not that young. So I've been interacting with the governments. No two governments in Delhi have reached out to outside experts more than the two coalition governments that were short-lived. One headed by Devi Gowda and the other headed by A.K. Gujral. These two governments were the most proactive governments that reached out to experts for inputs, for advice, and they acted upon, by the way, they acted upon advice of outsiders. They were the most assertive governments, in my view, even in relation to China and Pakistan. Even in relation to China and Pakistan, this period was, in fact, when history is written, I'm sure the historians will discover that Vajpayee was able to conduct the tests in 1998 because of the two governments of Devi Gowda and A.K. Gujral. You know why? It was at that time India came under tremendous American pressure to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT. The CTBT was devised at that time to close India's nuclear weapons option. The CTBT, even today, is not in force. Its purpose got defeated when India conducted nuclear weapon tests. When it came up out of nowhere in the mid-1990s to corner India and to close its nuclear weapons option. And those who designed it thought that a coalition government in India, in Delhi, led by this sleepy farmer, Devi Gowda, would kowtow. They failed. Then came I.K. Gujral. They again mounted pressure on I.K. Gujral. To his credit, he was the foreign minister under Devi Gowda. In fact, I knew him personally and closely. He had made up his mind. He played a very important role, Mr. Gujral, under Devi Gowda. He gave the right advice to the farmer, who I heard him say in my presence that he will never give up India's option by signing this treaty. It was Devi Gowda and I.K. Gujral who paved the way for Vajpayee's nuclear weapons test. And I think when history is written, I hope they get full credit for saving our nuclear weapons option. And I think that was the greatest contribution. And this is not the only area. There's several other areas where they were proactive. And I wish governments were more proactive than the governments we've had, because I've seen that, it happened with Vajpayee, it happened under Manmohan Singh, it's happening under Modi. The longer they have stayed, the more risk averse they have become. More risk averse. The longer you stay in office, the more risk averse you become. And that, of course, will require a psychologist to examine why governments in India become more risk averse the longer they stay in office. So that's beyond my, beyond my assessment capability.
Actually, you are running out of time because you have light to catch. So, okay, maybe one last very pressing question. Okay.
Yeah, you commented that China. You commented that China is expansionist, and much of your talk focused on, as a rival, the rivalry. Word like threat was used, I guess. But on what basis? Because we have fought one war with them, and the opinion of even some Indian commentators is that it was kind of our fault. We put our army too forward on a non-demarcated border. They attacked us, and then they declared a ceasefire and went back to where they were. since then there's been no conflict. So what is the basis for claiming China is expansionist and a threat to us?
Do you know where the Great Wall of China is located?
Yes.
Do you know Great Wall of China? Do you know where it's located?
Yes.
That was the outer boundary, the security perimeter of the Han Empire. Today, the Great Wall of China is located in the middle of China. China has expanded west of that wall by thousands of kilometers, south of that wall by thousands of kilometers. And also, do you know historically?
No, but I
One minute, let me finish. 1 minute, let me finish. You can ask me again. Let me finish. Historically, China and India were not neighbors. India's neighbor was Tibet. The frontier, Himalayan frontier in history, literature, look up anything, was known as the Indo-Tibetan border. There were no Han Chinese soldiers in the Himalayas, on the Himalayan border, never. Under the British rule, under the Mughal rule, go back to any period in history. There were no Han Chinese soldiers. And Sardar Patel, who was able to think through, wrote to Nehru in 1950, before the invasion of Tibet happened. He said, and this is the most profound letter that anybody has written to anyone in modern Indian history, in which he laid out what will happen if China were to invade and occupy Tibet. Whatever he wrote, please read that letter, has unfolded 100%, with such a prescient letter warning Nehru of what awaits India. This is before the invasion of China, China's invasion of Tibet began in November 1949. You said that there's only one war. How many wars do two countries have to wage before you identify? Let me finish, then you can ask. I'll let you come back. Before you identify the country as a rival or an adversary. Today, not only is China obliterating the very identity of Tibetans, it's even erasing the word Tibet. It has given a new name to Tibet called Xinjiang. Which country is laying claim to an entire Indian state? Which country? Bangladesh? Pakistan? Sri Lanka? Only one country is laying claim to the entire Indian state. On what basis? The Dalai Lama has said repeatedly that there were periods in history when Tibet ruled China, and there were periods in history when the authority in Beijing had suzerainty over Tibet. But that period was only when China itself was under foreign rule, which was either the Mongol rule, the Yuan dynasty, or when the Qing dynasty, which was the Manchu dynasty, was in power in China. Only then was so-called Chinese rule, that is ruled from Beijing, the suzerainty covered Tibet. But there were periods in history when Tibet ruled large parts of China. But on Arunachal Pradesh, Dalai Lama has made clear, and so history is very clear, that Arunachal Pradesh was never part of Tibet. The entire, if you're going to go by cultural and religious links, why Arunachal? The entire Indian Himalayan belt from Ladakh all the way to Arunachal believes in Tibetan Buddhism, has links with Tibetan culture. So you can claim the entire Himalayan region as part of Tibet. But that historically would be incorrect. So, as I said, in my presentation, it's not just about in relation to India. China is a revisionist power. It's revisionist in geopolitical, territorial, economic terms. And that means we have to face up to that challenge.
Okay, so
Okay. I think we can continue the discussion in the tea time. So he has to really leave. So
I
let's
actually,
thank.
I do believe I need to answer this because
Later. Please. Huh? Yeah.
By all means, I don't want to close this dialogue, but maybe,
Yeah, so let's thank the speaker for such a great talk, and thank you so much for coming here. It has been a great pleasure. Please join us for a high tea outside. Yeah, thank you.